With the summer sizzle starting to fizzle, cooler heads are looking to lock in a wellness routine fit for the fall and beyond. Lucky for you, Ritual's high standards don't drop with the temperature. Fully committed to traceable science and sourcing, Ritual is shaking up the supplement industry with high-quality ingredients and scientifically developed formulas. With them, you know what you're taking, where it comes from, and why it's important. They've got every base covered, from their clinically backed women's 18-plus multivitamin to groundbreaking options like stress relief and sleep melatonin, which both use first-of-its-kind bioseries technology designed to optimize formula delivery. And right now, for a limited time, get up to 40% off your first month at ritual.com/podcast.
Shop limited-time deals on last-minute gifts now at Lowe's. Save $50 on a Werner 6-foot aluminum stepladder. Was $89, now just $39. Plus, get your choice of select Craftsman V20 tools for only $39. And save time and money with free shipping on orders of $45 or more. Because Lowe's knows deals. Offers valid 12/5 through 12/11. While supplies last. Selection varies by location. Free standard shipping not available in Alaska and Hawaii.
It's the SNL Hall of Fame podcast with your host, Jamie Dew, Chief Librarian Thomas Senna, and featuring Matt Ardill. And now, curator of the hall, Jamie Dew.
All right, excellent. I'm feeling really good about today. Thank you very much, Doug Donatz, for that excellent announcement, as always. Before we get into anything, please wipe your feet before coming into the hall. We have a look and feel that we're trying to uphold here. So there's that. The SNL Hall of Fame podcast is a weekly affair. Each episode, we take a deep dive into the career of a former cast member, host, musical guest, or writer and add them to the ballot for your consideration. Once the nominees have been announced, we turn to you, the listener, to vote for the most deserving and help determine who will be enshrined for perpetuity in the SNL Hall of Fame. But this week, we're not doing that. This week, we have assembled a gaggle of pundits from the Saturday Night Network, and I'm really excited to have them reveal their ballots with me tonight on the SNL Hall of Fame podcast, roundtable number 3. Sitting to my right, yes, sort of. I'm joined by Bill Kenney tonight. How you doing, Bill?
I'm doing great, Jamie. Thanks for having me back again. This was a lot of fun last year, a lot of interesting conversation and debate about who deserved to get in. So I'm really excited to reveal my ballot.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting that you've got a ballot to compare against. You know, there were omissions this year that were locks for you last year. I'm real curious as we peel this onion.
Yeah, I feel like I have a new respect for baseball Hall of Fame voters now, who some years there's the obvious choices. Sometimes it's 20 deep and you have to cut off people who you normally would put in. I feel like that's what this ballot's like.
Well, we made the decision again this year to go with up to 15 votes. How many did you opt to use on your ballot tonight?
All 15.
Excellent. And you did last year as well, from what I recall.
Yes, I did.
All right. Now, new to the round table this year is Sammy Kay. And Sammy, I'm real pleased to have you join us. And I'm curious about what your expectations are, you know, as you put together your ballot and put it all together, I guess. Yes, that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, Jamie, thank you for having me. You know, some people who have listened to me on the SNL Network or other podcasts know I'm a big movie fan and a big Oscar fan specifically. So it's Oscar season right now. And so I'm in the spirit of looking at all these ballots that are kind of being posted on these websites of these anonymous Oscar voters and yelling at people for their ballot And now I'm on the other end of it in a sense. But instead of having that anonymity in me tonight, I am gonna, show to everybody what I'm voting for, and people can yell at me. So I'm expecting people to maybe yell at me. I guess that would be part of my expectation here. But most importantly, I'm just excited to have fun and just talk about some just absolute legends in SNL, and whether or not I deem them to be worthy of this honor to be in the Hall of Fame.
How many votes did you cast?
Yeah, this might be cheating because, I have basically like a solid 12, and then I have 3 people slotted in right at the end. So I did technically use all 15. I'm feeling not so firm on those last 3, and I think as we have this conversation, those will either be put into stone or, we'll kind of see how it shakes out. But definitely a firm 12 votes were used for me.
All right, and joining us again, a two-timer here on the round table number 3 in this case, is our friend Jon Schneider. How you doing, John?
I'm doing great, Jamie. So excited to be here. I know you always ask me to wipe my feet, so I went and got a pedicure for you just to make sure everything is all clean as I walk into the Hall of Fame. But very pumped to be here. Last year when we did this in May, it was quite the lively affair as I got together with Bill and Nicole and Andrew Dick to debate who deserves to get in on the first ballot. Some of these people potentially getting in on their second ballot. So different criteria tonight. And I'm excited to tell everybody why my ballot is the best ballot, and that's why we're here for.
Yes. How many votes did you end up using?
So I did use all 15. I can be convinced to take somebody off my ballot and put somebody else on. That's what we're here for. But I hope to convince others that maybe they should take people off of theirs and put some of mine on there. I think that the key for tonight is the ballots should be a little bit fluid, and then we finalize as we get to the end.
Excellent. This is great. This is high drama. Well, let's start at the start here, and we will go to Mr. Bill Kenney and hear his first balloteer nominee vote.
Well, Jamie, I have to start with, of course, the one I had the honor of nominating a few months back with Thomas, and that's Jan Hooks, all-time SNL cast member on the show for 5 seasons. And in my mind, the most important female in the history of SNL. As I said,
more about that.
Yeah. As I said to Thomas, it was such a dark time from the time the original cast left, when Gilda and Lorraine and Jane left, and the women were just relegated to these tiny roles. Even these brilliant artists like Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Mary Gross, Robin Duke, and they had nothing to do on the show. And when Jan came on, she was just such a tour de force. She did not let herself get put behind the boys' club with such stalwarts as Phil Hartman and Dana Carvey. And she held her own, and she had her own characters. And if you ask any female cast members since then, I think they would tell you that Jan was one of the biggest influences. Kristen Wiig said as much. Lorraine Newman herself said on Twitter that Jan Hooks was the greatest cast member of all time. So if a not ready for primetime player can say that, then I've got to say it too. She had so many great characters. Sweeney Sisters, Marge Keister, her Betty Davis impression in that all-time classic sketch. Anne Margaret, Tammy Faye. The list goes on, and she was taken from us way too early. And we didn't get to see a lot of her after her career on SNL. She never really came back except for the anniversary show. But I wish that she had. I wish that we had a couple of hosting gigs to see her in the past with as well. So Jan Hooks is my number 1 nominee going in.
There is the headline. Jan Hooks with the number 1 pick. Wow. Fellas, do either of you have Jan Hooks on your lists at all?
So I definitely had Jan Hooks on my list. I would say there are a few cast members that I have above Jan Hooks who I believe in totality probably, might be comparing apples and oranges, but, probably had a better SNL career than Jan Hooks. But I think with regards to legacy, she has a really important place in SNL's history. And I really look, and I say this with the caveat of being on this panel with three other men, but I'll say that women in SNL's history have a really interesting arc, right? Because, pre-2000, pre-Tina Fey becoming the first female head writer in the history of the show, it wasn't a great place for women to work. I mean, every woman who's worked at the show has said that. And I would say that with all respect to Gilda Radner and Jane Curtin, who had excellent careers on the show, I believe that pre-2000, Jan Hooks is probably the woman that stands out as defying the odds in a era that wasn't great for women on the show. Now, it really depends what you value as a cast member on the show, because in the post-2000 era, and I'll say in post-2010, obviously it changes even more and it became a female-driven show, but post-2000, there are a lot of women who had major, amazing careers on the show that I think are just as good as, if not better than Jan Hooks. So the question with Jan for me is not, does she deserve to get into the Hall of Fame? But to Bill's point about her being the greatest female cast member of all time, is it like, do we look at it because she succeeded so much in her era? And if we're not looking at the era when talking about Jan versus her contemporaries or versus other women in the SNL history, then I'm not sure that I would put her in over some other women in the history of SNL. Saying all of that, she's had an amazing career, obviously deserves to get in. Phil Hartman got in last year. You can't put in Phil without Jan. So for me, I love Jan Hooks on the show, and I'm happy to also have her on my ballot.
Yeah, well, we can make it a clean sweep here because Jan Hooks is also on my ballot. Not near the top, definitely not in those first couple of slots. She's like right in the middle of my ballot personally. And I mean, for me, that might just be, a bit of an age thing for myself. Obviously, it's an era of the show that, I wasn't even born to really kind of experience that firsthand. But just from like an objective perspective of looking at kind of the desert that was the 80s for SNL as how it was, not great for women. She was certainly a trailblazer. I was recently watching a video where it was right around the time she passed, and John Lovitz was being interviewed about her, and he even called her like the female Phil Hartman, and they were such a great duo. Bill, I actually listened to your episode talking about Jan today, like in preparation, and you said everything that needed to be said, and it makes a ton of sense why she was your number one choice on your ballot. So I definitely think she deserves a spot in the Hall of Fame. And as someone who talks about SNL on a show where we kind of look back at old episodes and old sketches, someone that, I think I could probably do a better job as a pundit, kind of, pointing people in the right direction, because she has so many great sketches that I feel like, I don't know if they've been like lost to time, but it's someone that I think we could prop up and talk about like a lot more in the community.
Before we move on, can I ask Bill just for his 2 cents on Jan, something I said about Jan? Yeah, Bill, just would love to know what you think, because we never get to have Jan Hooks talk really on the Saturday Night Network unless you guys are on the Superfan Takeover. But like, do you see what I'm saying? Because I have no doubt she's your favorite of all time, probably. And you have this love for Jan Hooks. And I do too. Just like, it's really hard to look at her career and say like, damn, that was a better career than, let's say, Kristen, who we may talk about tonight, or Kate or Cecily, think about that.
Well, here's the thing. And you're not wrong. But I think that without Jan, do we get Kristen and Kate and Cecily the way that we did? Not that they wouldn't have been on the show, but it's almost, it's not an equal comparison, but it's almost like a Jackie Robinson situation. Was he the greatest player of all time? No. But he was so good. He would have been a Hall of Famer in any other scenario. And he was a trailblazer, and he led the way. So are you going to put his statistics above some of his, later contemporaries? No. But without him, do you get to the next part? So I think that's why it's the most important.
I'll take that.
Great.
That's fair.
Great analogy. Well, sticking with Sammy, do you want to name your first ballot?
Yeah,
your first
absolutely.
vote?
This was kind of tricky, kind of ranking them all for me, because definitely when you get to the top, it is hard to kind of parse out like who is that kind of number one person. And for me, it's Will Ferrell with this crop of nominees. I think it's definitely something you can argue that, he is the greatest cast member of all time. He is somebody who can kind of fit into any era and kind of has shown that because he has come back and hosted, a number of times and not just in kind of a condensed time period. He's come back and hosted in, a couple of different eras as recently as, a couple years ago. He has 3 best ofs, there's, that's something he's, said on the show, and, the 100th digital short. And I think Will Ferrell kind of, we always compare cast members to other cast members, and, with this season, we're like, is this person kind of filling in Kate McKinnon's role or Cecily's role or whoever? And I think for Will Ferrell, he kind of created his own archetype on the show as like a Will Ferrell kind of performer. He was kind of one of a kind, had such incredible energy, was even able to pop in and do impressions. Obviously, George Bush is one of the most famous and beloved kind of SNL celebrity impressions of all time. And just so many characters and really defined his era as on the show as the Will Ferrell era. So, you look at the people who are currently in the Hall of Fame and you look at Will Ferrell and it just makes perfect sense that he should have a place there as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Just a fantastic pick. Curious what your fellow roundtablers feel about this pick.
To me, Will is no doubt a first ballot Hall of Famer. Absolutely. You have to put him in. I think he is one of the, he is a rare cast member in that, like, the second he gets on the show becomes incredibly better. And then the second he leaves the show is noticeably worse. Like, it's amazing to watch. And, a lot of people talk about, these great and grand stories of how Eddie Murphy saved SNL. Like, Will Ferrell saved SNL to me. I mean, I think SNL was probably at its lowest point, for a show that was on for 20 years and they were like, okay, maybe it's time to call it quits. And then we lose what would end up being some really, really big names in terms of the history of the show. Sandler, Farley, Phil Hartman left a couple years earlier. Like, it's just like, it felt that golden era had gone away. And Will comes on the show with and he has amazing contemporaries that he worked with. But I think what's most fascinating for me about his era is oftentimes we don't call the Will Ferrell era the golden era. We call it the Will Ferrell era because he was so much greater than anything we could see on the show. Every sketch, you look forward to just seeing him in it. And I think there's another comparison to that, which will come up in a little bit and we'll talk about. But I think that Will Ferrell is one of a handful of cast members in the history of the show that absolutely dominated their era when they were on. And to Sammy's point, I think he could have done it in most eras of the show. So it's no doubt for me.
I'm a giant fan of professional wrestling, and I often look at the career of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson right now and go, I can't believe that I used to watch him like in 1997 and 1998 in the WWF or WWE rather. I just can't believe that those two things are the same. And I feel the same way with Will Ferrell, like on SNL to a large degree now. It just almost feels like, did we really go through that? Did we really live through that and get to experience somebody that talented and that good at the game of SNL? Because, boy, oh boy, he dominated. He just dominated.
It's like when one of your classmates from high school like ends up going off and becoming super successful. You're like, yeah, I knew them once. Like, I went to school with them. Like, that's what it is with Will. It's like, okay, he's dominating the box office. It's like, we knew him when he was just Will Ferrell.
That's right. When he was getting the kids off the shed. Where was he on your list, Bill?
Number two, right behind Jan. The only pushback I'll give a little bit to John, I don't think he saved the show as much as Eddie did, only because he came in with better people. Whether or not he propped them up, did the chicken lay the egg? What came first? But being on there with somebody like Keckner and Mark McKinney, Sherry O'Terry, Molly Shannon, it was a better group around him when he came on the show, but the show was definitely in a lot of trouble as someone who lived through that and was sure that they weren't going to make it. I mean, the show was so bad in season 20 with all of these people that we adore now. And for them to come in with this mostly brand new cast and be able to do what they did was nothing short of miraculous, and Will deserves a lion's share of the credit. But yeah, I mean, we just did on the Saturday Night Network, we just did the greatest episode draft. And I kept getting I was trying to split up my picks between eras, and I kept coming back to Will. I could have done a Will Ferrell episode just based on all the stuff that he had done, the pre-tapes that he had done, the characters, the impressions. He was so incredible what he was able to do. And he did make the people around him better for sure. So John likes to say he doesn't like to rank cast members. I'd put him in the top 5. I don't know if I can put a number 1 or a number 2, but he is definitely in the top 5 of all time for me.
And I do like to rank cast members. I just like to define the criteria. I think a lot of people don't define what the criteria is. So I think that's a different.
Okay, that's fair.
Will Ferrell off the list for all 3 of you. So let's go down to the bottom left corner with our friend Jon Schneider and find out what his first pick is going to be.
Absolutely. So I mentioned that we're going to talk about somebody else who I feel sort of dominated their era. And it's another cast member that I have to put off the board. I have 4 cast members on my ballot. We talked about 2. I'm going to talk about the third of my 4 right now. And that would be Kristen Wiig, who I did nominate for the SNL Hall of Fame. To me, this is no doubt. I think that, she basically is the last piece of what becomes my golden era in the history of the show. They put together the perfect recipe of all of these SNL greats, and Kristen ended up being the cherry on top, and she comes in completely built in a lab to be on Saturday Night Live. Like literally everything you would want, take the best parts of anyone who's ever been on the show prior and put them into Kristen Wiig, and she is there. And the incredible moments that we have of the recurring characters and, as she starts to work with pretty much every single one of her contemporaries on the show is incredible. She was influential to a ton of people who were watching the show at the time who would go off and repeat her catchphrases or just know her as either the Target Lady or Penelope or whatever she was doing on the show. And then comes a point where she starts to rise above the crop as she becomes, works her way through her SNL career. And it starts to become the Kristen Show, which is really, really hard to do in what is considered one of the greatest eras in the history of the show, to be the dominant player there. And I find that she does that for many of her later seasons on the show. And I have found that she's a little bit polarizing because you have to love Kristen to be able to enjoy some of that work later on. But it's clear to me that everyone who worked at the show seemed to love her. I know everyone in my life seemed to love her. And then, of course, we end off her career with this incredible moment, probably the greatest send-off in the history of the show, with Mick Jagger singing to her, and everybody dancing with her, Lorne Michaels dancing with her. I mean, she is as iconic as it gets. And to me, this is a no doubt, no-brainer first ballot Hall of Famer, as someone who you can't tell the story of Saturday Night Live without.
I love it. A no-brainer, a first ballot Hall of Famer. Kristen Wiig. Yeah, I'm not even going to say, is she on your list, fellas? Like, this is, where does she show up in the top 5 on your list?
Well, what if she wasn't? What if she wasn't on my list? No,
wow.
I mean, similar to John, we're around the same age. We've talked a lot about how, like, this is our era of the show. And Kristen is number 4 on my list. And the 2 people in between, Will Ferrell and her, also happened to come from this era. So, it kind of goes to show, like, just my appreciation for it. But, it is pretty incredible when you look back to kind of see all the talent that was around or was on the cast at that time, and how successful they've all become and still are today, and all working together in each other's projects. The fact that Kristen was able to kind of, become the star, it is really amazing. And that's a really good point, John. And to the point where, unfortunately, for a couple of years on the show, for the other female cast members, it was kind of hard to get airtime because there was somebody like Kristen who was just becoming so big and kind of taking over the show. And yeah, she just has, so many incredible characters that, they brought back time and time again. And I think that is a big reason why, she could be considered polarizing, especially, during that era with recurring characters. Could sometimes be brought back 2, 3, 4, 5 times too many. But, I think now that we're kind of removed, obviously we're a decade now removed from her time on the show, I do think even for people who were kind of polarized by that, I think have even come around to the fact that, she's kind of a no-brainer as far as like an all-time great on the show.
Yeah, she's number 4 on my list as well. And the polarization always stymied me. I've never quite, I get like if you liked Nassim or you liked Abby Elliott and they weren't getting a lot of airtime, if the SNL network was on at that time, we'd be talking constantly about how the fact that these very talented women were not getting enough time on the show. But you can't blame that on Kristen. Like if Kristen's sitting in that meeting on Tuesday and they're like, we need you to do another Gilly, is she going to say no? Like, no, of course she's not. She's going to want to do that. So there's very few people that would walk away and say, no, I'm not doing those characters anymore. This was, too much. So I think that's a little unfair to Kristen, those who don't appreciate her. I hope Sammy's right and that the passage of time has kind of eased up on that thinking a little bit. But yeah, she's right up there with the best of all time. She's another cast member who put her in any era and she's going to hold her own. And she did so much on the show. And let's put this little comparison of Jan Hooks and Kristen Wiig together. They both did Kathy Lee Gifford, Sandra Day O'Connor, Diane Sawyer, and Anne Margaret. So, I mean, what else do you have to say?
Yeah, I absolutely adore her. I think that the storybook ending is so wonderful, and I think she's just a dynamite pick. So great work. We'll stay with you, Bill, and get your next reveal.
Well, I'm going to go with yet another cast member. I've got a lot of cast members on my list. It's hard to avoid with so much talent on the ballot. But this may be somebody who's a little polarizing too because of how much they did their characters. When they first came on the show, I wasn't a fan because they were breaking up my family. I had the cast from 86 to 89, and it was these 8 solid people, and we didn't need any outsiders coming in here and messing that up. But he came out and killed from his first episode. Has the biggest hit movie of all time in SNL history, probably either 1 or 2. Of course, I'm talking about Mike Myers. He was such an incredible, to walk into a cast that had gelled as much as that 86 to 91 cast had, as this very young, fresh-faced Canadian boy. But he had all these characters in his back pocket coming into the show. He had Dieter, he had Wayne's World. But then he built on that. He had not a lot of impressions, but he was on the show so much. He had the middle-aged man character, which was very funny. Lothar of the Hill People, Linda Richmond, of course. And this was an era where they did a lot of recurring characters too much, and he was a victim of that a bit. But again, not his fault, and it was always very funny. And to be able to take that Wayne's World 10-to-1 sketch and turn it into this massive $200 million movie is nothing short of miraculous. You can say Blues Brothers, yes, but that was music. Like you can flesh that out with as much talent as they had in that. This was a 5-minute sketch, which, as we know, doesn't typically work in the SNL universe. It's Pat. Yeah, I think Mike Myers is a no-brainer. Had a great 6 years on the show. Had a great career afterwards. Not to even mention, he never got to do Austin Powers on the show. I mean, he did Dr. Evil when he came back at some point. But that's my third pick.
John, I'm curious what you think. I'm curious what both of you think, based on some of the conversations we've had on the other roundtables. So where does Mike Myers fit into the puzzle of John?
So he's not on my ballot, actually. And the reason is because, yes, I do agree with part of your point, Bill, that he absolutely comes in fully formed. He's probably one of the best prospects that's ever debuted in the history of the show. I think he's probably one of the more skilled sketch performers that's ever been on Saturday Night Live. But as far as in the totality of his career, he was never the MVP of any season that he was on. He is in an era that Phil Hartman, Dana Carvey, Jan Hooks, and then later, Farley and Sandler dominate while he is there. He is what I would call somebody who has a couple spots in the show dedicated to him, where he's going to have a Sprockets, or he's going to have, like a Wayne's World. And those are going to be great, and people are going to talk about them, for years to come. But if I'm just looking at, like, compared to some of the other people on this list who absolutely dominated their eras, to me, Mike Myers is a Hall of Famer, but not this time. There's too many greats on the list for me to sacrifice one of them in comparison to somebody who, in my opinion, was probably the third or fourth best cast member in a given season they were on the show.
Yeah,
that's setting the criteria for what a Hall of Famer is, raising that bar. I love it. Sammy, I apologize for cutting you off there.
No, you're good. I was just, I guess, eager to jump in there because I mentioned before how I had like a 12 solid people on my ballot, and then I had these 3 tweener spots, and Mike Myers is number 15 on my list. And it's something that while I've been doing this process, I've been kind of trying to figure out, like, why is that? Because when I first got into SNL, one of the first people whose like best of DVDs I got was Mike Myers. And probably because I was already a built-in fan of his from like the Austin Powers movies, which are some of my favorite things, some of my favorite comedies as a kid, and Shrek. So as like a comedy legend, like outside of the show, he is, in my opinion, one of the greats, especially when you look at like character actors and people who can totally get lost in their characters, which is something that is a good attribute to have to be a successful SNL cast member. But it might just be the reason why he's a tweener for me is because he was surrounded by so many greats, and, kind of similar to what you were saying, John, not necessarily being, and I'm not saying you need to be the star of SNL to make it onto the Hall of Fame, but I don't know, it's almost like an unquantifiable thing to me as to why he was just like right on the cusp for me there. And I think he's still, like I said, he's number 15. If I end up using all my votes, I'll probably end up voting for him. I mean, he has so many memorable characters. Wayne's World is the biggest SNL movie, probably my favorite SNL movie. And you can argue that him and Dana Carvey as like a duo are maybe like the best SNL duo of all time. And I think Dana Carvey is like a slam dunk, one of the best. I mean, Wayne and Garth. And I'd argue Dana Carvey's a slam dunk first ballot SNL cast member, but he's obviously not in the running this year. So I don't know. There's a lot of thoughts in my head and conflicting thoughts on this one, which I think is very interesting. And I'd be curious to see if other people kind of have this kind of mixed feeling on whether or not to put them on their ballot.
I would say also, like, before you go, just go ahead, Bill, and then obviously give you free rein to respond to us. But to me, it's sort of like a Fred Armisen syndrome a little bit. Not that they're the exact same cast members, but it's like Fred was like such a great cast member, right? But then you're like, he's on the cast with like Bill and Kristen and Jason. It's like it starts to get like there's a lot of depth there, which makes him a victim of his era potentially. So curious if you completely disagree with us.
Well, I'd ask you, John, specifically, knowing how you feel about this certain cast member, substitute the name Mike Myers with Will Forte. And if Will Forte was on this ballot, I think that's a similar career trajectory as far as never being the MVP of a season, has these classic characters, these quotable moments, but never rose above the Bills and the Kristens. Would you put Will Forte in that scenario? So I think that's, wow.
Yeah, I would not.
Breaking news.
Yeah, I mean, when we did our cast draft, like in the summer of 2021, Forte wasn't taken. I mean, to me, there's I have to be, he's my favorite, and I understand that Mike may be one of yours, but I have to also just be fair to all the people who are listening to us who respect our opinions on SNL, and just say that I would not put Forte in over the people on my list.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't even say Mike is one of my favorites, to be quite honest. I would, on that list, on that 86 to 91 list, he would be middle of the pack for sure. I mean, he's behind at least 4 or 5 people for me. So I don't know. I get what you're saying, but I don't know. I still think with his overall breadth of what he was able to do, I think he's in.
Jamie, can you tell us what the other roundtable said about Mike Myers?
Similar argument. Similar argument that, one person had them ranked really high and then one person didn't have them on the ballot at all. And their argument was a little bit out of the spirit of what we're going for, because basically what he said was he was really good at Saturday Night Live, but that's sort of it. Like, you know what I mean? Like he did good feature films, like some good feature films, but never like So I Married an Axe Murderer is great, but it never got above that level. Like he never took it above that level. Like, and he was hot, the hot sketch. Where did he rank? Where did Wayne's World rank on the top sketches when you counted them down?
There was definitely in the top.
They're on the top
5.
20, right? Oh, it was
yeah. Wayne's
5?
World. Wayne's World was Wayne and Garth were number 4, as when we did rank this summer the greatest recurring characters of all time. So they definitely were up there as far as characters were concerned, but obviously not the same criteria as what we're evaluating today.
Yeah, it's almost like if you had a Hall of Fame for SNL characters, like a first ballot would be,
No doubt.
Wayne's World, Wayne and Garth sort of thing,
Yes.
versus
I have to agree.
is he greater than the sum of his parts sort of scenario, I guess.
Yeah, did he make the team better or did he make him better? I don't know.
I think he gets in eventually, but not for me right now.
Okay. Well, John, who would you put in next?
So I will say, like I said, 4 cast members on my ballot. I'm going to finish up my 4th cast member, which is right at the top of my list. And that would be a contemporary of Kristen's. It would be Bill Hader. To me, this is, in comparison to what we were talking about with Mike, this is a no doubt as far as, had moments where he was dominating the era. Right before Kristen Wiig, I think, starts to take over in the post Amy Poehler, Maya Rudolph world. It is Bill Hader who is probably leading the pack in that golden era. So he comes in, like he has one of the best first episodes probably in the history of the show. We get that amazing moment with him and Andy Samberg on Weekend Update where they're going back and forth and he's doing all of these impressions and it's like, whoa, who is this guy? And, you're watching him and the things that he can do. And he is like, he just came in with like a basket of like skills that was Phil Hartman-esque, right? Like that was the first time since Phil Hartman that anybody's come in and they're like, whoa, he can not only have amazing characters, but he could play a straight guy in a sketch and be really, really funny with it. It's like, Will Ferrell, like we talked about, had a lot of elements of what make a great SNL cast member. I think Bill Hader has more skills even than Will Ferrell does on the show. But Bill, to me, was probably in an era where he was less forced to use them as much as Will Ferrell did. So as far as, longevity is concerned, definitely hits that mark. He's 8th all time in sketch appearances, 7th among cast members. And for me, still probably even deserved more of a celebration when his career ended, and he's come back to host twice since then, has had some really good episodes. He's talked a lot since his time on the show about the difficulties he had and the anxiety that he had when he was on the show, and obviously a lot of people can sympathize with him and his feelings. But the crazy thing is like you would never know it watching him on the show, how nervous and anxious he was, because every time you turned on Saturday Night Live from 2005 to 2013, Bill Hader made you laugh. And to me, he's, again, a no doubt first ballot Hall of Famer.
100% agree as well. He was on my ballot for sure.
Yeah, I mean, he is that upper echelon of the Hall of Famer. I mean, I think the only other person in the history of the show that you can compare him to in regards to being able to do as many impressions as he did, along with as many characters as he did, is Phil Hartman. You've got the Daryl Hammonds who are in their lane, who are, doing all these impressions. And then you've got the people who are doing characters and like the Mike Myers and things of that nature. But it's very, very rare to find somebody who's so good at both. we've been talking a lot this season about James Austin Johnson and getting him into these straight roles, finding a place for him when he's not doing Biden or Trump or something to that nature. And Hader had that. And, he was the ultimate gamer in a classic era, the last really great era of SNL. So yeah, he's definitely on my ballot as well.
Yeah, no, Bill Hader was number 3 on my ballot. So as far as like all-time cast members are concerned, I mean, he's definitely top 5 for me as well. He is, like these guys have said or have alluded to, he is kind of like the closest thing to a Phil Hartman level performer that we've had on the show, with how versatile he was and how many different things he was able to do. He wasn't ever pigeonholed to doing one thing. And when you kind of look back at all the different characters he did, obviously Stefan is the one that we would have to highlight as far as the last 10 or 20 years of the show. One of the biggest characters, and the one that I think kind of transcended, and you still kind of see, like, as far as like meme culture goes, you still see like, kind of Stefan memes and GIFs, on Twitter and things like that. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know like what more I could say about Bill Hader other than like he's, one of my favorites. And, when I saw he was nominated, he was like a slam dunk pick for me.
Just going back to Stefan, it reminds me of Apple, the way they talk about some of their products now. They'll say, their services are a Fortune 100 business, just their services alone are a Fortune 100 business. And I feel like you can do that with Bill Hader. You can say like Stefan is like a Fortune 500 company on his own, like just as that character. If Bill Hader doesn't have that character, he's still spectacular. But Stefan could be spectacular as a just a one-off character that somebody else had. It's very far out. What else is interesting to me is all 4 of you have revealed your top 4 at this point, I believe. And they're all cast members. You've identified that. And that makes sense. These are the people that we see on the stage, and they're the ones that are personifying the work of the writers and getting that business out there. But what's interesting is all 4 of the cast members you chose are new to the ballot this year. There was no revisiting, or was there?
Jamie, I actually have not revealed my 4. I've revealed my 1, 3, and 4.
Oh,
my number
shoot,
2.
I'm sorry.
No, don't worry about it. But I think this is a good time to kind of jump into that.
Do it.
It's like a perfect transition point, because this is someone who was on the ballot last year. And when I saw that they did not make the Hall of Fame, I was pretty shocked that they weren't a first ballot Hall of Famer for, what they did for the show. And they aren't a cast member. They're writers on the show. It's The Lonely Island. I mean, I think looking at the numbers, they got over 50%, as far as like they appeared on over 50% of the ballots, but didn't make that threshold. As far as like talking about things that saved the show, I don't know if you can quite say that for the SNL digital shorts, but, bringing SNL to the 21st century and really taking advantage of the ability to make viral content and make things that just like popped with people my age. I mean, I don't think that me and my friends would be big SNL fans if we didn't watch it when we were in middle school. And it just so happened that The Lonely Island was making those digital shorts and coming out with things like Lazy Sunday and Dick in a Box like around that time. And I don't know if I would be as big of an SNL fan if those kind of things didn't align at like that exact same, the exact right moment for me. On the SNL network, we did a whole best of the SNL digital shorts episode where we talked about so many of the digital shorts that they did on the show. And for me, it was hard to, when you like go back and watch them all, there's just like way more than people talk about. Like obviously people talk about, I'm on a boat and the music videos that really popped, but they were just like very consistent on the show and had their own space to kind of do whatever they want. And they opened the doors. I mean, obviously they had, in the past pre-tapes on the show going as far back to, Albert Brooks during the first season. But, they definitely made the SNL digital short or the pre-tape on the show something that you wouldn't ever not have a pre-tape on SNL anymore going forward. And I think that is because of the Lonely Island and their contributions. So yeah, they're number 2 on my list, and I ranked them that high because, you know, I need them to get into the Hall of Fame, and I'm pretty disappointed they weren't last year. And so this is kind of a statement that I'm trying to make on my ballot that, you know, you guys messed up last year, and we gotta you know, pick up the pieces this year.
Yeah, it's so strange. Perhaps this is an indication that I need to run an A and B ballot or something like that to pre-test things, and maybe it shouldn't have been the Lonely Island. Maybe it should have been on the ballot, like their 3 names, so people would have saw Andy Samberg and you know, been more likely to vote for it. I don't know. But yeah, it got 52.9% of the vote last year, and we're actually delighted to be joined by the person who nominated them. And that is Jon. If you want to expand on anything Sammy said, or you reiterate anything you said last year, or perhaps dazzle us with something brand new.
Well, Jamie, you do whatever you have to do to get them onto the Hall of Fame, because this is a travesty. What are we doing?
Right?
Yes, absolutely. This is crazy. To me, if you didn't hear my thoughts previously, I'll give you just a brief summary. But nobody's had more influence on me in my life probably than my parents, I guess. But the Lonely Island, you know, maybe the Lonely Island over my parents. But I honestly just absolutely loved them coming onto the show, Andy, Akiva, and Yorma, and you know, during the most influential years of my life, which are typically high school, that Lauren traditionally talks about as being the most important time to watch the show. They like increased my high school experience like tenfold, just in just how much fun that we would have, and that, you know, from a social perspective, we would get together, friends and I, to watch these shorts and, you know, make, you know, versions of them ourselves. And they were just like, the fact that they got like all of these celebrities to come on in week after week and like do fun things with them, it was just like, it made SNL cool again, you know, like that's a really big deal. And besides just like talking about me, I mean, how about the fact that like they sort of like made YouTube? You know, that's a huge thing that I talked about when I did nominate them last year, is that YouTube starts, and then they, you know, everything that every Generation Z and you know, like kids being born these days, like all they ever do is like take videos and post them on TikTok, right? Like, you know, like, hey, like Lonely Island kind of started that. And right when YouTube was going, they had the viral videos there. And I just think that like they were the thing, you know, generations of SNL watchers looked forward to most for a long time on the show. Put up brilliant work. I don't know that you could really argue against having them in the Hall of Fame. So to me, this was a stunning upset last year not to put them in.
The writers got no love on the ballot last year.
Not at all.
It's kind of stunning. But when you look back at, and we'll talk about some of these writers later on, I'm sure, but it's hard to find what they wrote necessarily, especially from the 70s and the 80s, kind of having to hunt down. But The Lonely Island is right there for you. And it's so funny. They did so many of them. Put all that aside, they changed the trajectory of SNL, period. Nothing in the last 20 years has changed the way people watch SNL more than The Lonely Island. I'm always going to be a guy who watches it live, but I'm also the guy who's going to be watching on Sunday, rewatching on YouTube, looking at those videos. And they started that. And that's so important to keeping the show alive. You know, would it still be here if Lonely Island? Yes. But I don't think we'd be seeing anywhere near what we've seen. I don't think any of the stuff that came after them, you know, Beck and Kyle, PDD, they were obviously hugely influenced by The Lonely Island. So I think that's a no doubter. They were number 7 on mine.
True that. And Jamie, can I also just say to the audience, because this is going to be my thesis for this particular podcast, when we get to some other writers that are on my particular ballot, please, I'm begging you, do not discount the writers when you are making your votes. Yes, there are some sexy names that are hosts of the show that have been cast members, but like, we want this to be like really legit. So really consider about like who helped make this show as influential as it was. And when we, argue about why certain writers should be in the Hall of Fame, it's important to remember that.
Couldn't have said that better myself. That's exactly it, right? You guys are, these early Hall of Famers are shaping what the Hall of Fame is and what it means to be a Hall of Famer. So, their omission is a terrible one for sure. On a more positive note, let's hear somebody else's next ballot. Where did I leave off? Who is up to bat next? Is it you, Bill?
Well, I am going to bring in the first host of this roundtable. This easily one of the top 5 hosts of all time, if not the best host of all time. 10-time host, all the way back to season 11. 5 cold opens in those hosting, which is unheard of. 10 cameos on top of that. Has worked with every era since season 11. Of course, I'm talking about Tom Hanks. There's so few hosts that can go into multiple eras. We just saw it with Steve Martin last month. Alec Baldwin, who may or may not come up later, is another one. But, a lot of these hosts kind of stick to their eras, and we're starting to see that more and more with John Hamm's and the Justin Timberlakes. But Tom he was in just a couple of months ago in a cameo, and it was like the highlight of the season up to that point. So many good characters, all the way back to Mr. Short-Term Memory, Girl Watcher with John Lovitz. And he had some decent impressions, too. He's done Dean Martin. He did Dennis Miller at the Weekend Update desk. And, of course, he started us with the Five Timers Club back in 1990. He was the first one officially inducted into that group and brought back into that secret room with Mr. Steve Martin and Paul Simon. But yeah, he's been with us through so much. He got us through the at-home era in 2020, the Christmas episode last year, in 2021 rather, where the show basically got canceled because of COVID, and he was able to kind of step in and sit there with Paul Rudd and put together what they could. Just a tour de force, never mind his acting skills. He's such a brilliant actor. I've loved him all the way back to Bosom Buddies. So, it's nice to see that he's still relevant almost 40 years later on SNL.
Yeah, he'll always be Uncle Ned to me. So, Sammy, does he meet your criteria?
Well, Bill, if I got our numbers right, I think we have him at the exact same spot. I have Tom Hanks at number 5. On my list. Is it because he started the Five Timers Club? That's just a happy coincidence. Yeah, no, this is Tom Hanks. It's awesome and underrated almost. Maybe not underrated, but it's awesome that arguably the best actor ever, or the best movie star of all time, the biggest actor ever, is also a friend of SNL and a longtime host and has such a strong relationship with the show. I just think that's just great. And the fact that, like you said, Bill, he's able to weave into different eras, and it's a testament to his acting ability. And, he got his start in comedy, so it makes perfect sense that he, makes for a great SNL host. Like I alluded to before, we got to talk about the Five Timers Club and how that's one of those things that even non-SNL fans know about, I think, is that it means something to host the show for X amount of times, and there's a secret club you get into. And the fact that it all kind of started with Tom Hanks is I don't know. It's a notable thing when I'm looking at who deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. There's kind of certain accomplishments or kind of asterisks that I look for that make someone a Hall of Fame host or cast member or whatever. And I think that for Tom Hanks, is something that put him so high on my ballot.
Whoops. Great. I got to figure out if I'm going to use mute or I'm not going to use mute or, John, where do you weigh in on me using mute or not?
I think you should use mute and just let us keep going without you. But no, honestly, for me, Tom Hanks, this is a no doubt, definitely gets in on my ballot and very high up on my ballot as well in the top 5. For me, might be America's dad. I think he's SNL's daddy. Like, he just comes in every single time he's there. He's amazing when he's on the show. Like, I don't think he's had like a bad episode when he's hosted. Hope nobody kill me on that, but I really don't think so. I think he's just had like these incredible moments when he's been there. And I love what Bill said, which is just like transcending eras as a host. A lot of the hosts that are really amazing hosts from the history of the show really dominated an era as far as hosting is concerned. But in Tom Hanks' case, like he's probably best known for with that second golden era cast, like really coming in season 10, 11, 12, 13, 11, 12, 13, 14. But it's really fascinating to get to see him like come back in 2006. Like, he's hosting in 2020, like during the COVID years, he's like basically hosting the Paul Rudd 5-timers episode. Like, he's had so many moments throughout the history of the show that I just absolutely love Tom Hanks as a host. And it makes sense. Like, I think if you're going to put any host in there, to me, he's in the upper echelon, the pantheon of great hosts from the history of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. He's Rushmorean for sure. Well, let's go to Sammy next and get your next pick.
Yeah, so we were just talking about, the writers and how, we need them to get some love in the Hall of Fame, which I totally agree. And I'm going to talk about Seth Meyers, who, I was able to go in depth on this show with Thomas, talking about his time on SNL as a head writer. I mean, obviously he started as a cast member, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about him as a head writer. And if you're looking at golden eras of the show, his time as a head writer and just the kind of environment that has been talked about a lot as far as, the competitive nature historically that SNL was, it seemed like specifically when he took over and was head writer, he just made SNL a very collaborative, great place to work and make comedy together. And I think that is something that is shown, like the proof is in the pudding with his time and the sketches that were out and, came about during that time. Not to mention, when you talk about him as a head writer, you got to talk about him as a Weekend Update anchor. And I think, for me, is probably my favorite Weekend Update anchor of all time. And something that, I didn't really think about so recently as to why is because the way that he kind of interacted with characters on Weekend Update, with just always wanting the person on the other end of the table, whatever wacky character it was, whether it was, drunk uncle or whoever, he wanted them to do well. And it wasn't like an antagonistic relationship with the characters. He wanted them to succeed. And I think that made for just great comedy and a fun rapport. So yeah, that is why I am voting for Seth Meyers here in the writing category.
Great pick. And follows in line with Tina Fey, who was the first writer elected to the Hall of Fame last year. Cast member, a Weekend Update anchor, and head writer, similar trajectory. But I think that's a great pick. Does he appear on your list, John?
Absolutely. Yeah. This is also a no doubt for me. Seth is, I think, 9th on my list as far as putting him in the writing category. I mean, if he was just there as a cast member, definitely not, but we're not, he had a very fun first few years. And I think self-admittedly was not the greatest pick as a cast member just in sketches on the show. But like as the leader behind the scenes that he would eventually become, as the anchor that he would be to all of his amazing castmates for years and years on the show, he worked great with people. He also worked great alone. He wrote some amazing sketches. To me, he is such an integral part of the show. And I think if Lorne Michaels is the general manager of, what's happening here, I think Seth Meyers was the manager of the team for a very long time. And like that role is extremely crucial, one that ultimately he'll sort of like hand off the baton to Colin Jost to. But I think, for me, in my like greatest era, as far as when I was growing up, he is so influential in creating that environment in the first place. And I have to award him for his efforts.
Fascinating. I like that sports analogy a lot. He's more tactile. He's in the, he's in the trenches with the people. Bill, what did you think of Sammy's pick?
He is not on my list. There were a couple of difficult cuts. I think, especially with the writing category, there are too many people who need to go in ahead of him. I appreciate what Seth did, especially for how long he did it. He has some of my favorite sketches of the last, 15, 20 years. Comes to mind the Louis C.K. Abe Lincoln parody that he wrote. Of course, the Peyton Manning PSA in that classic episode. And of course, all the Sarah Palin stuff that he did for Tina. But now it's just, there's too many writers who did not get in last year who I would like to see get in, who were there long before Seth was there. So he had to be a last minute cut for me.
All right. Wow. Shocking. But based on our own little count here, he would get into the hall because 2 out of 3 have chosen him. So you get off lightly there. Where are we at? We are with John. John, with your next pick.
Yeah, can I just say that was the worst thing I've ever heard Bill say on any podcast since we've been working with him.
Listen,
Yeah.
I'm not dissing
Same.
Seth at all. I mean, but you've got to put in the people who he was able to build a career off of before you could put him in my opinion.
No, that is insane. Because
Why,
then you're just
why
gonna,
is that insane?
Because then you're just going to put in all the people who were good on the show in the early years of the show. And I know,
No, not at all. I mean,
Okay.
Tina went in last year. She was on my ballot. It's not just that, but she was the only writer to get in last year, right, Jamie? Yeah. So,
Yeah.
like, all of these other people who are still on the ballot who did
But I'm
not
not telling
get
you
in.
not to put them in on the ballot. I'm just saying that you if you're going to evaluate them against each other, there's no way that you can argue to me that Seth isn't a more influential writer than some of them.
Oh, yes, I could.
Okay, all right, we'll see. Yeah.
We'll see.
Because I think so we're not there yet, but we'll talk. Because I actually have 3 other writers on my list that we'll talk about. Because I do think it's important to include them. But I think Seth is if not above, right there with them.
Who has he been influential to? Just so I understand what you're saying.
I don't think that you can say that the third golden era that we talk about all the time as absolutely loving, the last great era in the history of SNL, happens without Seth Meyers being the head writer.
Interesting. What about Mulaney? What about Paul Appel?
I mean, Mulaney comes in partway through, is pretty good. I think Paul Appel started way before Seth, so Paul Appel is
Still there.
No, I'm not saying that these other well, I mean, if you're gonna go that route, then we could say okay, when we get to these writers from the first 5 years of the show, let's talk about all the other writers that were there at the same time that are not on the ballot.
Sure.
We're not if you're saying that Seth had so many other great writers during seasons 32 through 38, let's say, then I guess, but he is clearly the leader of that pack. Anyways, yeah, where were we? Sorry.
You're going to name your next
The most
pick.
heated John and I have ever gotten. I'm a little,
I
was
always
about
have
to
the
go.
host- Yeah.
I was about to go make some popcorn and just watch you guys duke it out. Even though he was on my ballot, I just I wanted to watch.
next point, counterpoint. Seth
I always have to
Meyers.
host the show. I never get to just go at it. All right. I'm gonna do it. It has to be done. So somebody has to do it here. I'll have the balls to do it. I'm gonna put Alec Baldwin in the Hall of Fame. I don't think he can't. I mean, let's be real. I mean, nobody's cool with him. To my understanding, shooting what was supposed to be a prop gun and killing somebody on the set of his movie. No doubt, there is a very reasonable chance Alec Baldwin will never appear on Saturday Night Live again. It could happen. We don't know. I mean, I'd be surprised if we see him, before the 50th. I think he probably should be invited to the 50th. I don't know. That's up to the listeners to decide, but that's a debate for another time, I guess. But regardless, let's look at his time on the show, which is an absolute domination of the show. Hosted the most times in the history of the show, most sketches as a host, comes back a cajillion times. Yes, you might hate the fact that he played Trump in an era where he ends up, pissing off the then president. But when he came on as Trump versus Kate as Hillary, that was a modern version of SNL taking over the news, just how big those debates were during season 42. And for me, that is just the beginning of going through the list of amazing moments that he's had. He's worked with almost everybody that's ever been on the show. He, no doubt, mean, like it's really fun, like this exercise of going back and watching old Alec Baldwin episodes, who completely physically probably changes how he looks throughout the entire time. He's also, I mean, he's just had so many fun moments. Once hosted with one of his ex-wives, I believe, and like there's anything that you can do as far as like bucket list is concerned on the show, Alec Baldwin has hit those notes. So for me, it's like, if you said to me, hey, like, here is the people who've made the SNL Hall of Fame and there are hosts in there and Alec isn't in there, I would say, like, is the only reason you're not putting him in there because you don't like him as a person? And if that's the case, that's your prerogative. But if we're just evaluating time on the show, I think I have a really hard time hearing an argument that he doesn't deserve to get in.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's really tough to forge an argument to keep him out based on just his work. And if you want to come at it from the Trump angle, Thomas and I were having a discussion, and I believe he says it on the episode, that he only played Trump while hosting one time. So the other 40 odd appearances, or however many appearances it was that he played Trump, were all as a guest. So if you can sort of separate that out in your head as well, if that's tarnishing your experience with Alec Baldwin, there's an argument to be made there as well. Bill, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I completely agree with all of John's points, although I would say I think the Trump stuff is more controversial only because it was an accidental shooting. And while he is maybe radioactive at this point, I don't think that's the reason that most people would leave him off. I think the Trump stuff would be the bigger problem for people. I
hope so.
I could be wrong, but if, again, as Jamie says, like that's not enough of a reason. And it's another scenario with we talked about with Kristen. It's not his fault. He thought he was coming in to do this 3 or 4 times, and then Trump was going to lose, and then he was going to go on his merry way. He kind of got stuck in this role and was asked back every week. And of course he came back and did it. Could he have walked away earlier? Yes. But, who knows how influential Lauren was with him and pressuring him that we really need you to do this. So I'm not a fan of the Trump stuff. I think he did a pretty good impression. I won't rewatch most of that at this point. And I rewatch SNL constantly. But that's not a reason to leave him off. 17 times hosting, 52 cameos, covers from season 15 to almost present day. Good impressions besides Trump. He did a great Tony Bennett. He did De Niro. Obviously, Bill Brasky, Pete Schweddy, excuse me. And yeah, he covers all these different eras. He fit in with every cast. So yeah, he's a slam dunk for me. He's number 10 on my list.
Okay, Sammy, you've got the distinction here of maybe settling something here. Is it the incident on the film set with the gun, or is it the Trump exposure that would taint things one way or another for you?
Well, I really think we should just take the rest of the show and really dissect that incident and really get to the root of all of that right now. No,
or the shoot of all that.
Yeah, exactly. He is on my list. He's actually right where we're at right now. He's like number 7, and it's because it goes back to accomplishments on the show. And how do you not have the person who has hosted the most times, not be in your Hall of Fame? Obviously, that's like a record that can change, like let's say Steve Martin hosts again or 1 or 2 more times and takes the record back. I still think Alec Baldwin has a place in the Hall of Fame. And as far as like the Trump stuff is concerned, maybe this is like an anecdotal thing for me, but I find that SNL fans have a lot more negativity towards that than like the general public. I think the general public, and the reason why they kept bringing it back is because they were eating that up. And they were, just talking about my parents, like my parents would always talk to me after SNL about Alec Baldwin's Trump. And is it because they were just doing Trump and that was like in the news and, oh, wow, Trump did this crazy thing this week and Alec Baldwin happened to be the person to do it. They're watching SNL differently than I am. But I do think there is a bit of a distinction there between us hardcore fans, not to be like gatekeeping on the opinion of Alec Baldwin's Trump, but it just is something I've seen. And regardless of any controversies or whatever, if we're looking objectively as far as like a Hall of Fame is concerned, the numbers don't lie. And, I think he definitely should be in the Hall of Fame if we want this Hall of Fame to be accurate to the show's history and various accomplishments.
Maybe it'll turn out that he gets punished by not getting in on the first ballot, and that's sort of the voters, tisk to him. I'm not sure. It'll be interesting to see, and it'll be equally interesting to see the score with which he either gets in or doesn't get in. Sammy, we'll stick with you, and I think you said he was your number 7. So what were you at number 8?
Well, 8 was actually where Jan Hooks was for me.
Oh, right.
So
I remember Jan Hooks.
So number 9 here, we're sticking with hosts. This is kind of where these all kind of came about for me. I'm going with John Goodman. Again, someone who I think if you're just looking at pure numbers should be in the Hall of Fame. Obviously, in my lifetime of like watching the show, like when I started watching in 2007, he's only hosted once. He hosted once in 2013. And the majority of his hosting was in like the 90s and was hosting year after year. And, maybe that is a reason why he didn't get in last year. I don't have the number in front of me as far as like what percentage of the vote he got, but
31.6.
Okay, yeah. So honestly, with those numbers, he probably isn't going to get in this year, especially with this new crop of talent being brought in. But I do still think it's important as far as eligible hosts of who has made an impact on the show. I mean, he was there for SNL 40, and he's talking about how many times he hosted, and he said 13 times, a Goodman's dozen. Like he's definitely a person who, if you're looking at hosts on the show, I think deserves to get in. But yeah, again, when you're looking at the other candidates, I can see why that could be a tough road for him as we increase the number of eligible people, for the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I actually made the argument last year to put him in. He was on my ballot. He was a victim of the numbers this time. He just barely missed my ballot. I think he's very worthy. But yeah, with the hosts that were put on newly this year with Tom and Baldwin, I didn't really have a choice but to drop him down a little bit. I think he's a little bit below what they did on the show. Especially he gets kind of lost in those numbers of being on at the same time that Baldwin was on all the time. Tom Hanks, Danny DeVito was on all the time at that point. Steve Martin was still on quite a bit. So he fell back a little bit for me. I think he gets in, but he doesn't get in this year for me.
It'd be interesting to know the inside baseball of, like you said, his contemporaries in the 90s were doing not the same number of shows that he was doing. He was doing it every single year, and Hanks and Baldwin were, doing 3 or 4 episodes in the decade, but they carried on and he didn't. Like he just, it's almost like he was a great pitcher in the dead ball era or something. And his numbers are being distorted as a reason. But I think he belongs in. I think he ultimately gets in. But yeah, with numbers in the mid 30s, it's going to be tough to see that happening this year, even if he grows considerably. John, how about you?
He's absolutely on my list. I mean, not putting him in the Hall of Fame to me is kind of stupid. I mean, he hosted 11 years in a row. Like, what else do you want? Like, that's crazy. Like, it's never been done. I guess Mulaney's on this modern streak. It's it's like watching a hitting streak in baseball. Like, when will it stop? But to me, he was a very influential, and I always looked at it this way. Like, I think there's like a big 5 when it comes to hosts in the history of the show. You obviously have Alec and Steve, Tom Hanks, Buck Henry, and John Goodman. Like, I think they're like in a class of their own as far as like historical accomplishments on the show. You may prefer other hosts, or other hosts have gone on specific runs that you may enjoy, but I think John Goodman is just as much part of that class. And I think I said the same thing, on this panel last year, but like if we were doing this in 2005, let's say, 15, 17 years ago, he would be like in the top 5 of people's lists. It's just like totally washed away due to time. So I disagree with not putting him on your ballot.
Yeah, I agree with the length of time. It's too bad we hadn't thought of this at the dawn of podcasts.
Damn it, Jamie.
Or something. But yeah. So he'll be another one. It'll be interesting to look at his numbers this year. And we will move on to John.
Well, I will go with a writer here. And I will go with Michael O'Donoghue, who did not get into the Hall of Fame last year. And I think this was a big mistake. I think if we're talking about great people, it's a controversial one. O'Donoghue is known as being kind of an ass. And there's a lot of stories about his treatment of people at the show that aren't fantastic. But when you're talking about the original head writer of the show, one that really laid out the tone of a lot of the original days of the show, I think he is a very important part of SNL's history. I believe I also said last year, I think if you have a writer's wing at the show, it's hard not to call it the Michael O'Donoghue writer's wing of the SNL Hall of Fame. I mean, I just think he is such an important figure, one that was fired and then brought back and then fired and then brought back and then quit and then fired and then brought back. He's just so much a part of those early seasons. And while everyone was still trying to figure out what SNL was, O'Donoghue had a vision. And you may not have agreed with it, but when you watch those early days of the show, you see O'Donoghue's work extremely clearly. And to me, his influence on the creation of the show alone is worthy enough to put him in the SNL Hall of Fame. And he's actually number 5 on my list.
Wow, very high up.
Yeah.
So he scored last year just at the quarter century mark, 25.8%. So crazily low. And again, I have to just assume that's just people not familiar with his work, who he is, and the importance of who he is. So listen to that episode from last year if you get the chance before casting your ballot. But before we do that, we'll hear from Bill and Sammy on your pick.
Yeah, he's number 6 for me. I made the argument last year, his dark comedy is something that SNL would probably never do in this vein again. And while it's hard to find each sketch written by each writer because of the time and it wasn't done as it is today, just go back and watch some of the first 5 years, and any of the sketches he's in, he wrote. Mr. Mike's least loved bedtime tales are hilarious. Him coming on the stage and pretending he's Tony, Orlando, and Dawn, and what would happen if we stuck hot pokers in their eyes, and he falls on the stage and starts screaming. He wrote a lot of the very funny Weekend Update jokes, including the famous Professor Backwards one, who, when Professor Backwards died, his last words were pleh, pleh. He wrote the ABBA on the Titanic, one of the most famous musical guest moments in the history of the show. And then, of course, he came back for Ebersol, season 7, scared Catherine O'Hara away, and was fired after making a Silverman as Hitler sketch. So, yeah, I mean, he is controversial, but he was brilliant. And the material is there for you to go back and look. If you're going to vote for this Hall of Fame, go back and do the work and look and see what this brilliant man was able to do.
And Bill, how much would he love Sarah Sherman now?
Oh, could you imagine the collaboration those two would do together? It just boggles the mind.
Yeah. So, guys, I hate to disappoint, but he is not on my list, and I don't have a good reason for it, honestly. I think, as we were talking about earlier in the episode, with all of these new kind of candidates for the ballot this year, there were a lot of sexy names as far as hosts go, and famous writer and musical guests and stuff like that. And I do have that wiggle room at the end of my ballot here to potentially swap him in. And like I said, I don't have an argument. He is definitely, like you said, an architect of those first 5 years of the show. But yeah, looking at, obviously the votes he got last year, I will be curious to see if that's something we can overcome. I'm going to say no, and I'm part of the problem, clearly, with that. But after hearing you guys talk about him, he's definitely somebody, as I'm finalizing those last couple spots, he might slide in there. So
take one mic off and put another mic on.
there you go. Yeah, I mean that would be the spot. So, but you guys will have to. I'll have that internal debate in my head as we continue the episode.
All right, Bill, who is your next pick?
I got a lot of crap last year, specifically from Andrew Dick, for leaving this person off of my ballot. I said that they kind of ruined their legacy by staying way too long and making some of the driest, non-funny stuff that SNL has seen in the 2000s. But I've lightened up quite a bit. I heard him on Fly on the Wall with Dana and Spade, and I've softened a bit. So I'm going to nominate James Downey. You can't argue with his breadth of work. 30 seasons on the show, all the way back to season 2, excuse me. He was in 40 sketches, including the very famous First Citywide and the Grayson Moorhead. Of course, he was Andy's dad in Lonely Island. And he had so much influence on the politics of the show, whether or not you agree with his viewpoint. He was able to bring Aykroyd back in '88 when they did a Democratic primary. Aykroyd came back as Bob Dole, and kids' cameos were very rare back then. So this was huge news that one of the original cast members was coming back to do a cameo. And of course, he had a part in Chippendales and Strategery with Al Gore and Bush. So I can't leave him off again. I gave him the 1-year punishment for overstaying his welcome, but he's one of the most important writers in the history of the show, bar none. So James Downey's going in for me.
This makes a little bit more sense to me now when I look at his score. Last year, it was 30.3, so 5 points higher than Michael O'Donoghue. But the fact that you didn't cast a vote for him sort of supports that score a little bit more to me, because as somebody who follows the show the way you do, I would have just thought for sure you would vote for James Downey,
It's all Bill's fault.
I mean, that the dryness of the mid-aughts of the politics, and just, it was, I mean, go back and watch some of those cold opens from 2005, 2006. They're not good. They're just not good. And it's not because it's topical. They just weren't funny. They went on for 13, 14 minutes and they didn't have a lot of jokes. And so that kind of tarnished his legacy a little bit. But then you just can't argue with what else he was able to do from 1977 through the early 2000s. So, yeah.
Where do you have Downey on your list, John, or is he on your list?
Oh, he's absolutely on my list. He is 10 on my list. I have him there, but he is probably the most influential political writer in the history of the show. Obviously not everything clicked for Bill, and that's fine. And politics is probably the most subjective part of watching the show. You either absolutely love getting some SNL political wit, or you hate it. And, you're going to strike out more than you succeed. But, when you really, really hit with something, it's great. And I think a great example of that is all the stuff that he did with Dana Carvey's H.W. Bush. I think he was really brilliant with a lot of those. And that is a lot. Dana obviously credits Downey for a lot of that stuff. To me, he's a really, really major part of the show, because when you go back and you think about those early days, Chevy does a lot of Ford earlier on, and he does Ford as a version of Chevy Chase. And he's falling down, and it's just we're going to put him in the Oval Office, and we're going to have him keep falling and being clumsy. And there's nothing smart necessarily about it. And I won't argue its influence, because I think it's a very important impression in the history of the show. But it's really when Downey comes on and starts writing for Chevy as Ford in the early part of season 2, and then Chevy obviously leaves, and then Aykroyd's Carter, and then starts to write, Aykroyd's Nixon, and then, starts to involve more political figures, and then eventually, keeps going later on in other generations. To me, that is really an aspect of the show that isn't celebrated enough. And I really think that he is, especially due to longevity, so important to tell the story of SNL. So for me, it's an absolute, he deserves to get into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, no, he is on my list. Jim Downey was number 11 for me. Yeah, I mean, for all the reasons you guys said, people come to SNL and know SNL for its political commentary. And every time there's a new election, when election season's coming up, the ratings go up for SNL because people are anxious to see like how they're going to skewer, the new lineup of, Democratic and Republican candidates. And, I mean, John put it very well. Like there's a notable shift in how politics were covered on the show, when Jim Downey, joins the writing staff. And, without that, who knows, like, as far as, where SNL would be as far as like a place where people go to when it comes to, political humor. So I think it's definitely worthy of a vote.
Sammy, we're going to stick with you then and get your next reveal.
Yeah, this one I think will be interesting because I've heard, or I recently listened to your guys' discussion last year on, the class of 2022 Hall of Fame, and this person was kind of debated between you guys. So I have Norm Macdonald next on my list. He was so close to getting into the Hall of Fame last year. I think he got the most amount of votes without making it. I think he got like 60% or 61% or something like that. And yeah, I mean, I think you can argue that what he was able to do on Weekend Update was pretty groundbreaking. I mean, he didn't pull any punches, and during that time, because of that, he was eventually fired for making the OJ jokes. And I think a ton of Weekend Update anchors after him, always point to Norm and look to Norm as an influence, and how he was like a kind of a measure of quality or something they were kind of striving to do on the Update desk. And I think for those reasons, he should have gotten in last year. And it'll be interesting to see because of how the timing was with everything. Obviously, he unfortunately passed away in 2021, and maybe that affected the vote, in the positive for him. I mean, he got more votes than the Lonely Island, which I found to be really interesting, when it comes to the people who listen to shows like this and sometimes can skew, maybe a little younger. And, the fact that Norm Macdonald was able to get that many votes was impressive to me. So we'll see if he gets in this year. But my vote is for Norm.
Yeah, you're right on the money. 61.9% is what he got last year. And it's hard for me to imagine him getting much more than that this year, because I think you're right. I think he would have garnered a few votes just based on the news cycle, and how terrible that sounds, because I'm a giant Norm fan. But I'm not sure that I think he's been pushed off my ballot this year. So John or Bill, if either of you want to chime in as to where Norm Macdonald lands on your or doesn't land on your ballot, that'd be great.
He is not on my ballot. I love Norm, and I actually just recently in our best episode draft picked him as my Weekend Update anchor, and I loved getting to see him on Update. I wish he was on Update for longer, but I just can't argue that he deserves to get into the Hall of Fame this early on. I think he's a very influential point in SNL's history. I think he's one of the top few greatest Update anchors ever, but I just don't see it as far as like the other names on this list who clearly had more contribution to their time at the show. For me, like it alone, it's really hard to argue that an Update anchor deserves to get in over like amazing sketch performers who put in like their times and dominate their eras, or amazing hosts who come in and like, to me, it's a little apples and oranges. And the reason I do have Seth in, just to not talk out of both sides of my mouth, is because obviously Seth has a lot more to do with his influence on his particular era and his writing writing cast members into sketches and elevating them. So for me, like Norm is, he's so like spotlight on him solo in his time on the show that you can only like, it's so clear and easy to evaluate. And I think that, one day he might get in, but like to me, he's like that person that gets in on like the 8th or 9th ballot and it's just like held steady for a long time. It's like, okay, Norm's about to fall off the ballot, so let's like push him up there because he had a really important role in his time on the show.
Bill,
Yeah, same as John. He just fell off my ballot, and I voted for him last year. There was just too many new cast members on the ballot to justify putting on someone who had only been on the show for 4 years. Mostly did Weekend Update. Obviously, his Bob Dole was really good as well, his David Letterman. So he did do other stuff. He wasn't a Dennis Miller or a Seth on their time at the desk, but I don't want to understate his importance. He was so important to the way Weekend Update went. It had kind of fallen off after Dennis Miller. Kevin Nealon was just out there telling dad jokes and wasn't very good at that part of his job. And Norm kind of flipped that on its head and didn't care if he got the laugh, didn't care if the audience was with him. He was going to tell his jokes and he was going to do his thing. So it's really hard to leave him off. He's probably number 16 for me, but he's not getting in this year for me.
Yeah, it might end up being somewhere around there for me as well. John, what is your next reveal?
All right, so I have 4 people left on my list that I'm going to vote into the Hall of Fame. And the one that I would say I think needs to get in the most would be the duo of Franken and Davis. Also, extremely influential writers. And I think just in terms of longevity, super important. So I'll take you all the way back to, they come on the show and they're almost like assistant producers in terms of them, the things that they did to help Lorne produce the show. And they are given their own segment on the show, which happens every now and then where Franken and Davis come on together, and which is really fun. And then they're sort of the first featured players actually in the history of the show are Al Franken and Tom Davis. And they wrote so many sketches from the early years on the show. They end up leaving around the time that Lorne does. And we get a return of Al Franken for many, many years on the show, who ends up being a very important assistant producer, writer, and featured player. And he comes in many times. But obviously, other tentpole moments for Al Franken specifically, you think about the Al Franken decades, the Al Franken eras when he's talking. And I mean, he's a big reason why Brett Silverman had problems with the show. You think of Limo for a Lamo. I mean, these are really famous moments from the history of the show. And then I also think, for Tom Davis, not to sell him short, I mean, I think about there was a very famous monologue where it's discovered that Tom Davis has been living in a bunker in the SNL studios for many years. So these two are the OG writers and influential members of the crew. So much so that I feel like SNL is a completely different world if they were never on it, and I have to put them on my ballot.
Couldn't agree more. I think so influential. And just to answer a criticism that I've received, why there are people that are lumped in together. We've talked about 2 of them so far this evening, and they're the only 2 that are actually lumped in together, other than musical guests. But The Lonely Island, and then now Franken and Davis. And the reason they were nominated together was because they're known for their work and their output that they put in together. Franken and Davis were actually hired as Franken and Davis. Their actual writing credit is Franken and Davis, or Al Franken and Tom Davis, on the credits they get the and. So that's the reason that was chosen. And
well, you would do the same with Please Don't Destroy if it was now.
I think so. I think the same thing would hold true. I'm just trying to see where they are in terms of votes last year. And why can't I see them? 29.7. Yeah, that 30% chunk is just a hill that these writers are having a difficult time climbing. So we'll have to continue to stump for them, fellas.
Yeah, and not only, they're a duo, but for the first season, they got one salary to split among themselves. So that's something that's bananas that would never happen today. But yeah, I mean, they are a very, very important part of the show and the history of the show. Not only, as John said, that they have their own playground to do their sketches, which are still very funny. Some of them are, I guess, problematic by today's standards, but still very funny. And when John was talking about Downey a little bit earlier, they had a hand in a lot of the political writing then too. They were part of Nixon's final days, and they were part of the famous Ask President Carter sketch. They wrote all of these with Downey, so they were collaborating quite a bit, and they were part of Pepsi Syndrome, which is still the longest sketch in the history of the show. And then they did their own thing too. Davis had a lot of influence on the Coneheads and Nick the Lounge Singer, Continental. So yeah, I mean, they weren't just there the first 5 years. Davis floated in and out until the early 2000s, and Franken was there until the mid 90s. So they covered multiple eras, and they had a lot of influence. And since they're being nominated as writers, I won't hold Stuart Smalley against him.
Tom Davis, isn't he not responsible wholly, but he had a big hand in that Steve Martin hosted episode with the Blues Brothers as the musical act. I believe there's like three different sketches that Tom Davis, including the King Tut sketch, had his fingers in. And it's just, if you have a night like that, you could just hang up your hat, put it on the thing, and just, you're done. That's a great night.
Yeah, they only wrote the majority of what is mostly considered the greatest episode in the history of the show.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Sammy, a lot of pressure here.
Yeah, again, I think I'm just part of the problem when it comes to the voting body. They're not on my list. They were right there at the end where I was trying to decide what to do. But I think the problem I ran into with my voting was that I saved a slot for musical guest, and then I might have over-indexed when it came to hosting. I actually mathematically tried to figure out, like, percentage-wise, like what percentage of my votes should go to cast, what percentage should go to host. And there's definitely, maybe my logic was wrong, or my thinking was wrong, and I should have given more flowers to the writers here. But yeah, I mean, Franken and Davis are definitely super influential, as you guys said, to the beginning of the show. But, just with 15 slots, just didn't make it.
Yeah, that's how it breaks down. Everybody's got different votes. So
we won't bully you like John bullied me.
Sharing them.
Right.
I think the listeners, Sammy, are saying you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, and gosh darn it, people don't like you. Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
Bill, do you want to reveal your next pick?
Yeah, I'm going with yet another writer. We're going to get these writers in if it kills us. This is considered one of the best writers of this era, in an era when there was the Conans and the Greg Daniels and the Bob Odenkirks. To a T, to a man and a woman, they all say that he was the funniest writer on the show. Of course, I'm talking about Jack Handey, not only known for his deep thoughts, which permeated the pre-tapes in the 90s, but he had such an influence on so many of the funniest sketches that you love from the 80s and the 90s. He was there for, I believe, 13, 14 seasons, but if you've liked Happy Fun Ball, Toots' Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer, Giant Businessman, which is one of the best Tom Hanks hosted episodes and involves Phil Hartman, Old Glory Insurance, the Clarence Thomas hearings, he was a part of all of this, and thousands more that we can't even get into. But he is just such an important part of that second golden era of the show and going into the late 90s and the Will Ferrell era. So yeah, that's an easy one for me to put in. He's number 13 on my list.
Yeah, when your peers speak that highly of you, it's a no-brainer. Sammy, was it a no-brainer for you?
I'm feeling like I have no brain here at the end of this episode here. Yeah, not on my list. Again, that's just not on me for prioritizing the writers. But I mean, I feel like, when I first started watching the show, like Deep Thoughts, when I was watching those reruns on Comedy Central, definitely had his own like unique voice and his unique spot on the show to do that, as well as a bunch of other, just contributions as a writer for sketches. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense, but just didn't make the cut.
Did it make the cut for you, John?
He did not, actually. He just got cut off the list. He is a very influential writer. I remember discussing with you, Jamie, that he should get on. He should be talked about this year as potentially getting on people's ballots, and there should be somebody who should argue why he should get into the Hall of Fame. And I think he will eventually, as long as the writers are properly attributed for their work on the show. But I think this is a situation where, Bill, we were talking a little bit before and arguing about Seth Meyers' influence. I think for me, the 5 writers that I put into the Hall of Fame this particular season, or this time we're doing this, Franklin Davis, Jim Downey, Seth Meyers, Michael Donahue, and Lonely Island, to me, had more influence. I think Jack Handy probably had a higher batting average, but I think that those 5 are probably in a category of their own, and Handy's in that next level of really great writers that probably deserves to get in. So for me, he just misses the cut.
Shocking news here, but I like the argument. I like the way you put it together. Sammy, we're back to you with your next pick.
Yeah. So for my next pick, like I said, I over-indexed it on hosts, and maybe that was a mistake, but I'm sticking with it. And I've got Candice Bergen on my ballot, the first female host, ever on the show, and as well as the first woman to ever join the 5 Timers Club. Obviously, the majority of her hosting appearances were with the original cast, but I don't know. I just always really enjoyed her chemistry with the original cast, especially with Gilda Radner. A sketch that comes to mind is The Right to Be Extremely Stupid, or Extreme Stupidity, where she kind of flubs the line, and there's a great improvised moment between her and Gilda, and she was just totally game. And as far as just looking at my ballot, I mean, I just gotta be honest, it's very male dominated. So I really did want to find a spot here for Candice Bergen on the list on my ballot, and not to mention, there are definitely hosts from the beginning of the show who are still around with us, but don't necessarily appear for whatever reason. And even though she hasn't hosted in a while, she's still someone that is called in from time to time, as recently as a recent 5-timer sketch with John Mulaney. And so for that reason, you can really see her spanning and, throughout the history of the show. So that's why I saved the spot here for Candy Bergen.
I think it's important to note that Lorne himself has said that the first show that felt like the show that the show is the show that she hosts. I believe it's the 4th episode. So the importance of her, it can't be understated. Both of you nodded your heads. Now, I have the luxury of seeing you. Not everybody gets to see you. Both of you nodded your heads when Sammy said or made his reveal. So I assume that means both of you have her on your ballot?
Absolutely. Yeah. She's on my ballot. I think she's so influential. I mean, it was great to finally get a female host 4 episodes in. And she comes back again. I mean, not only that she's the first female host, but she's the first Christmas host. Comes back the second season, hosts at Christmas time. Again, begins this tradition that most people know of, skating on the ice rink at the end of the holiday episode, which happens many times throughout the eras. So for me, she's really a great host who's only hosted 5 times. But as Sammy mentioned, has come back a few times. She was there for the Timberlake 5-Timers Club, the Jonah Hill one, and then again for Mulaney, and widely celebrated as far as the original female host, and one that I hope hosts again in season 50.
That would be really cool to see.
She's an easy in for me. Hosted 2 of the first 8 episodes as well. And there was something about the Christmas episodes with her that were so special. We pine for these people that we know hosting the Christmas episode even to this day. It kind of started with her, that you wanted this familiar friend of the show, so to speak. And she was in so many great sketches, the Jaws 2 and the Bee-Capades and The Right to Extreme Stupidity, as Sammy mentioned, Consumer Probe. So I don't think it could be overstated how important she was to the beginning of the show, her and Lily both, and kind of giving a female voice to the show when it desperately needed it.
Also, the first returning host in the history of the show. Like back then, if we were doing podcasts, we'd be like, whoa, we didn't even know this could happen. Like they could bring people back.
She hosted twice before Buck Henry ever hosted. So
exactly.
John, I believe you said you have three left.
I'm down to 2. Yeah.
Oh, you're down to 2 now. That's right, because we just did Candace Perkins. So you're down to 2. So flip a coin and tell us which one you want to tell us about.
I have to go with the one that anyone would expect me to talk about. Of course, it's Justin Timberlake, who absolutely will get a vote on my ballot. Again, talking about dominating your era from a cast perspective, like how about from a host perspective, who comes in during a particular era of the show and becomes that cast's pretty much favorite host. I mean, just like, what a Justin Timberlake episode looks like. And I believe last time we did this in May, Andrew, Dick, and I argued hard if that is a good thing or not to have a host come in and have a template for what their episode looks like. But I believe that all of the greatest hosts in the history of the show have some version of a template. So I don't think that
Mulaney has one at this point.
For sure. And I don't think you should be penalized for that. And I think that I won't debate the merits of Mulaney versus Timberlake in case somebody else has Mulaney on their ballot, but I'll just say, for me personally, Justin, it changed the game for me as far as hosts were concerned. I think there's, that the show felt the same way when they put him and Jimmy out at SNL 40 for the cold open to be the ones to open the show. And just in terms of, like, everybody knows my love for him, but just in terms of just a pure talent, the fact that he can act, he can dance, and he can sing. And, I go back to like his season 32 episode, which is the Dick in the Box episode, and he's performing there. And there's times where he'll perform, he'll go like cold open into the monologue and then go perform and then into sketches or whatever. And he is just like putting on an absolute show, the same way that you would go to a Justin Timberlake concert and walk away and be like, damn, that was amazing. Whenever he hosts the show, it is an event. So for me, he is no doubt on my ballot, and I know he'll get it eventually, as long as I keep fighting for him.
You can't give up the fight. Bill and Sammy, I wasn't paying attention to whether you nodded or shook your head, so you'll have to just tell us. Bill, does Justin Timberlake appear on your ballot?
Yeah, he's definitely in for me. Definitely the best recurring host of the last 20 years. First 2 episodes are complete up and down classics. All the different things that he did, besides the stuff he did with Andy, the Barry Gibb talk show, the Hip Hop Kids, was in one of the Target lady sketches. Yeah, it's a no-brainer. Plus, he was the musical guest 3 times while he was hosting. So, not any doubt in my mind that he should be in for sure.
Yeah, it might just be a waiting game. Where did he land last year? 34.8. So whether or not we see a move this year to the plus or the minus will really tell the tale, I think, whether this is going to be a waiting game or whether he's just not going to, he's lost with the 90s for some reason. Sammy.
So he is on my list. There was in my, when I was going through this, just looking at like stats wise, I mean, the one thing that was holding me back, and maybe this shouldn't be a factor, is he has not appeared on the show in like 10 years, like at all, like in like cameos or anything. Like I think SNL 40 was his last appearance, if we're counting that as, I mean, obviously it's part of SNL, but as far as like the actual show is concerned, like I don't think he's appeared since like he hosted last, which I guess is like a little concerning to me. But I mean, if you're looking at the actual work that he put in, he's been involved in sketches, parts of sketches that are, some of the most famous of the last couple decades, things we've mentioned like Dick in the Box and all those sketches with Andy and everything he did with Jimmy Fallon. I'm hoping that if he does make it on the Hall of Fame and he somehow sees that he's made the SNL Hall of Fame, that convinces him to come back to the show, even if it's for a cameo. Like that's, John, I'm sure you would agree you'd want that.
I thought you were going to say convinces him to come on our podcast, which I would be open. I would be open to it,
No, like we had Bobby on when he returned to the show after many years. We got to have Justin as well. Like that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, like I would be able to speak. It'd be fine.
Yeah, I was going to say, who's going to host since John will be comatose?
Get a little puppet of John, and someone will.
We'll keep it. We'll
get Bill Hader.
We'll keep it going with Sammy for your next pick.
Yeah, yeah. So I think this is my last pick. I think everything else has been said for me. And honestly, I was really in between here on whether to go with a musical guest, which I kind of secured a spot for, or kind of a passion pick. And like right here at the end, I think I'm nixing the musical guest, and I'm putting in someone you just mentioned, John. I'm putting in John Mulaney because he, like you said, when it comes to having a formula for a hosting gig. For the last 5 years, when John Mulaney has come onto the show, you've known it's been like a stellar all-star episode, one of the highlights of the season. And I think going back to my kind of Oscar brain and movie brain, there's something that kind of happens where you're kind of not giving people their flowers, during the time that they're really succeeding. You kind of have all these makeup awards, later down on the line. You're acknowledging something, 10, 15 years later. And I think it's time to acknowledge now John Mulaney, the second fastest person to join the Five Timers Club since Buck Henry. My stock, I'm buying stock on this John Mulaney run early because I think this is the year that will kind of prove whether or not he kind of is like the next like Buck Henry or Steve Martin, someone that's going to be hosting and potentially breaking a record, in the coming years. But I think it's possible. And this doesn't even mention the fact that he was a writer on the show during, one of my favorite eras. And, we're talking about him as a host, and he's able to bring that flavor and even in some cases bring sketches that, he had in mind for his time on the show and bring it into this new cast. And, I'm hoping he's given the opportunity to do that again this year. So I'm putting in John Mulaney as somebody who I think we should reward him now for, kind of the work he's been doing the last couple of years.
All right. John Mulaney. Interesting pick.
I mean, nothing against my namesake, but it's too soon. I just think, he's hosted 5 years in a row. I don't think the Mulaney story has been told yet, and that's not his fault. I just don't know that we have like a closing chapter to that. And, similar to the way that we're not putting in current cast members, I sort of feel like though Mulaney had a very great run as a writer on the show, which I'm not trying to take away from that, which that chapter has been closed. But if he was nominated in the writing category, I think we could start to talk about him there. But if he's nominated in the hosting category, I feel like this is a story that's ongoing. So for me, it's really hard to evaluate and compare him to some of the other, people on my ballot.
Yeah, same here. You almost compare it to, managers in baseball or coaches in football. They want to make sure they're absolutely retired before you put them in the Hall of Fame, because, if there's still more to be said, you don't know. What if the next 4 hosting gigs are just the worst things we've ever seen? Unlikely, but I would be very close. Another 5 years, if he's hosted 10 years in a row, then we really have to start talking about him. But I'm not there yet with John.
Well, who are you with? I think this will be your last pick.
I believe so. I am going to put in a musical guest. Went back and forth on this, but I have to put in Dave Grohl for his overarching story with the show. Been an 11-time musical guest with 3 different bands, 2 of which are, all-time bands. Obviously the Foo Fighters and Nirvana. And he's just been around the show so much. And there's certain anthems that you think of with the show, especially when it comes to music. I think of Paul Simon singing with Art Garfunkel, George Harrison being on the show. And I think Dave Grohl is kind of the modern equivalent of somebody like that. Them singing Times Like These after Biden won in 2020 was kind of one of those snapshot moments of the history of the country, not only SNL. So I wanted to make sure there was some kind of representation with musical guests. So I'm going with Dave Grohl here.
I like it. I like the pick a lot. John, how did you feel about it?
This was my last pick as well. And I think regardless of trying to represent the category, I think Dave Grohl deserves to get in no matter what, because I think his contribution, obviously the Nirvana performance is known as like one of the most iconic musical moments in the history of the show. Then he comes in with Foo Fighters, who have been there so many times, let alone another time with Them Crooked Vultures. And it just seems like whenever they need a big musical moment or somebody to step in, it's let's call Dave and get his band into the show. And I always my thoughts and feelings on music has always been that particular segment of the show is not as easy to evaluate or talk about because it's extremely subjective. It's like, do you like this music or do you not? But you can't argue against the facts and the stats that Dave has put up as a musical guest. I mean, he's been there a lot. I mean, he's also appeared in sketches himself a few times. So for me, he is what I would call on accomplishments, as far as accomplishments are concerned, the greatest musical guest in the history of the show. And as a result, I think we have to put him in the Hall of Fame if this category is going to be taken seriously.
Yeah, 100%. 100% agree. And Sammy, you're off the hook, obviously, because you've exhausted your list. So I don't have to bore you by asking my question again.
Yeah. Well, it's funny though, because he was the musical guest I had picked.
Oh, really?
For obvious reasons. And yeah, like I said, these last 3 spots here on my ballot, like when I actually vote, like they're still in play. And, I think as far as musical guests are concerned, like my biggest kind of debate was between that and Paul McCartney. And I mean, there was good discussion last year when Paul McCartney was on the ballot about the Beatles, and obviously during Lauren's offer to get the Beatles on the show, like that argument was definitely enticing. But when it comes to kind of like what these guys said, like number of appearances and stuff like that, I mean, if any musical guest should get in, it is Dave Grohl, and he might still end up getting my vote. But I did want to keep things a little interesting and not have us all have the same ballot. No listener wants to hear that. So
no,
I did it for the fans.
Well, stay tuned for February 6th when we reveal, that's next week, we reveal the class of season 2, I guess is what we'll end up calling this. And the next one will be the class of season 3. This is a great deal of help for me that you guys have lent some time and thought behind this. It helps shape what the Hall is. The people who listen to this, no doubt, take what you have to say very seriously and hopefully vote, with the newly acquired information that they've received. Where can they find more of you should they want to find more of you through socials or whatnot, Mr. Kenney?
Well, thanks for having me again, Jamie. It's been a lot of fun. Always fun to talk about the history of the show. You can follow me at BKLove73 on all the socials.
Great. Sammy?
Yeah, so you guys can find me at that Sammy Kay on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and find me all over the SNL network, including our Superfan takeovers, where I'm on the show with Bill and Andrew Haynes and Andrew Haskell talking about our favorite moments from SNL history and a lot of the people that were on the ballot today. So definitely, if you want to hear even more about their time on SNL, like definitely check out our show.
Jon?
Well, I guess if you're listening to this on January 30th when it comes out, right, Jamie? That's the date?
Yeah.
All right. Well, then I hope you enjoyed that amazing Michael B. Jordan episode of Saturday Night Live. How good was that, right? So hope you enjoyed that and enjoyed our hot take show and are looking forward to the next episode of SNL coming right up. I'm going to manifest the Justin Timberlake episode of Saturday Night Live coming up next. But yeah, I mean, this is really fun, obviously, to be with all of you. You can find me at Jon Schneider 24 if you ever want to chat SNL. Always love getting to hear from everyone in our community. And for what we are doing at the Saturday Night Network, we have 4 shows a week that cover modern day SNL. We have our hot take shows immediately after the episode airs, our roundtables on Monday where we break down the episode even further and discuss historical context, our by the number shows on Wednesday night where we talk about statistics, and our patron feedback shows on Thursdays where we answer your questions about SNL and look forward to the next week. You can always podcast with us if you would like by registering at patreon.com/the SNL Network. And Jamie, just want to thank you as always for including myself and all of the personalities at the Saturday Night Network on your platform. It's a privilege getting to be in tandem with you guys and help the SNL Hall of Fame continue to grow. So I appreciate you, Jamie and Thomas.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That means a lot. That's what I've got for you this week. Thank you very much for joining me. If you'll do me one favor, on your way down the hallway, make a right at the Weekend Update exhibit and turn out the lights because the SNL Hall of Fame is now closed.
Thanks for listening to the SNL Hall of Fame podcast. Make sure to rate, review, share, and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media at SNL HOF. This is Doug Denant saying, see you next week.
Podcasts and such.
New holiday deals just dropped at Lowe's. Get up to 30% off select major appliances, plus an additional $75 off for every $1,000 you spend on select kitchen major appliances from brands like Whirlpool, KitchenAid, Amana, and Maytag. And don't miss big savings on DeWalt. Save $80 on a DeWalt 20-volt max 2-tool combo kit. Was $229, now just $149. Lowe's knows deals. Offers valid 12/5 through 12/11. Cannot be combined with additional discounts. See Lowe's.com for details and qualifying items while supplies last.